On the morning of July 23, 1991, in New York City's Washington Heights neighborhood, the police received a disturbing call from the 34th Precinct. Two construction workers were fixing a road near the Henry Hudson Parkway, about 40 miles from Dickman Street in Manhattan. They smelled something bad coming from a wooded area by the road. The smell got worse and they found a blue and white cooler. Curious and concerned, they started to open the cooler's lid to see what was causing the strong smell. When they discovered a few cans of Coke, underneath those cans, there was a black plastic bag that contained what seemed like human remains. When the NYPD detectives approached the scene at first glance, they were not sure if the remains really belonged to a human. This was assumed given the fact that the place was used as an illegal dump site where people often dumped their waste, along with deceased animals. However, an inspection of the garbage proved otherwise, as the skeletal remains were quickly determined to be human. Inside the garbage bag, the young female child was lying in a fetal position with her hands clasped together, bound with rope and a cord from Venetian blinds. The decomposing body was completely naked and bloated. In addition to the Coke cans, the garbage bag was also surrounded by water, which the investigators suspected to originally be ice. They estimated she had been dead 6 to 8 days before the cooler was found. They believe she was dead for a week, and the hot sunlight not only melted the ice but popped several of the cans, causing soda to leak out and destroy forensic evidence such as fingerprints and DNA. The body was then taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. Although identifying the body was impossible due to the level of decomposition, the autopsy result brought out several significant details regarding the cause of death and the physical characteristics of the victim. The coroner determined that the child was either white or Hispanic and aged between 3 to 5 years. She had long, wavy dark hair which was pulled back in a ponytail. The child was also believed to be extremely malnourished, weighing only 28 pounds, which was quite low compared to children of her age. The report also indicated that the young girl had been sexually abused and died on or about July 18, 1991, as a result of asphyxiation. Without a doubt, the findings suggested that the little girl was regularly tortured before her short life came to an abrupt end. Unfortunately, no other clue was found that could lead to the identification of the poor child. Clearly, the NYPD detectives were landed with the daunting task of not only identifying the victim, but also tracking down her killer. In the neighborhood of Inwood, Manhattan, which was considered to be a place of rampant crimes, this crime stood out as a symbol of sheer brutality. In an attempt to crack this case, the NYPD detectives tried out every tactic they could possibly think of, from distributing flyers to urging the people to come forward if they had any knowledge about this Jane Doe. Police tried everything but came up empty-handed. The murder received plenty of attention from both the police department and the media back then, and investigators had every reason to believe that someone would soon come forward with information. And people did come forward. In the initial phase of the investigation, countless tips came in. That came in just 6 days after the remains were discovered. The caller, who did not identify herself, said on a Sunday in July 1991, she was going to a wedding, and from the toll booth of the Hudson, they saw a Hispanic man in fleece and a Hispanic woman in heels walking north on the parkway with a picnic cooler in their hand. The lead seemed legit but did not go anywhere. And in the end, the woman denied cooperating with the police by helping them create a sketch. There were other tips, including a young female drug addict who claimed the girl was her niece and a grieving grandmother who insisted the child was her granddaughter, both of which yielded no results. Sadly, every other lead NYPD detectives followed hit a dead end eventually. Detectives scanned through the National Missing Children databases, but nothing panned out, leaving the deceased child without a name. As the mystery deepened in the case, so did the affection of the detectives for the little Jane Doe. Since no one knew the girl's name and the cops had no way of identifying her, she was given the name Baby Hope, because by then, hope was all they had left in their attempts to solve the Jane Doe case, and they truly hoped that it wouldn't take long for justice to prevail. After a few days of investigation, an anthropologist developed an enhanced sketch based on the bone structure of Baby Hope and distributed it to the media. This was the first sketch that showed what she might have looked like, but even this effort remained fruitless. For nearly 2 years, Jane Doe's corpse remained in the NYPD morgue when detectives decided it was finally time to let her go. In those 2 years, no family members came forward to claim her, and the NYPD took the responsibility upon themselves to provide her with a proper burial with their own money. On July 23, 1993, on the second anniversary of Baby Hope's remains being found, uniformed cops from NYPD carried the tiny coffin of Jane Doe, which was led by 8 children, to the Campbell Funeral Home on Wadsworth Avenue, Manhattan. The lead detective, Jerry Giorgio, actively participated in the funeral. While his wife bought a white dress for Baby Hope to offer their affection for a stranger they only knew by death, not only the detectives, but the community also played their part. More than 500 people from the neighborhood attended the funeral while praying for justice for the little girl. She was buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx with the name of Baby Hope etched on her black headstone. Over the years, both the detectives from the NYPD and the people from the community periodically visited her grave and left her things in her honor. Without any solid leads to go on, the investigation into Baby Hope's case went nowhere. Although the NYPD never gave up on this case, the urgency of the case faded away underneath all the new crimes. Throughout the years, there were minor developments in the case, but it mostly remained cold. With every anniversary of Baby Hope's murder, local media in New York ran the story in hopes of refreshing the memories of a potential witness or spreading awareness of this horrific crime. The efforts always fell short and the case remained cold. By 2000, there were many new technologies and forensic profile developments that were introduced into the criminal system which were not available back in the 90s. Seeing that the technologies were proving to be helpful in other cold cases, the NYPD attempted to utilize these techniques in an attempt to build a forensic DNA profile on Baby Hope and run it through all missing children's databases. But that effort remained unsuccessful. As technology continued to progress, Baby Hope's body was exhumed for DNA tests 2 times in the span of 4 years, the first one in 2006 and the second one in 2011. None of them proved to be significant, as detectives were still not able to unveil the mystery of Baby Hope's identity. With encouragement from the public, the NYPD reopened the case in 2013. In July of the same year, on the occasion of the 22nd anniversary of the discovery of Baby Hope, the NYPD tried another round of publicity on the case. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood where her body was found, hung flyers, and distributed the sketches of the girl and a photograph of the cooler. They even announced a $12,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Their efforts finally got a breakthrough in the case for the first time in 2 decades. After seeing the flyers, a woman called the New York City Crime Stoppers, the tip line for New York City, to share some valuable information. She shared with police a conversation she had overheard in a laundromat 2 years ago, in which a woman claimed that Baby Hope might have been her sister. The tipster also provided several pieces of information to the police regarding the woman's family. This tip led the investigators to a 27-year married Brooklyn mother of 3, Laurencita Lorena Ramirez. As investigators knocked on Lorena's door and she opened it, they were met with a shocking Lorena had a striking resemblance to the police sketch of Baby Hope, almost providing reassurance to the detectives that they might have come to the right place. So without wasting any time, detectives began questioning Lorena about her missing sister. Lorena said that she had not remembered anything about one of her sisters being missing, even her name. That was until Lorena was 11, and her younger sister Maribel rejoined her family after staying with her father's family for years. It was Maribel who told Lorena that she remembered being suddenly awoken by something one night. She then went on to witness her sister's body being stuffed into a refrigerator and placed into a cooler later on. She also remembered looking to the other room and seeing plastic bags placed on the ground along with the conversation between 2 adults, which included the sentence, "She doesn't fit." However, neither Maribel nor Lorena ever came out with this information. Lorena did not even link Baby Hope's case to these memories until a few months after the anniversary of the discovery of remains, when she was watching it on a TV channel. The story was eerily convenient as far as Baby Hope's murder was concerned. However, investigators needed a parent for a DNA match, which led them to Lorena's mother. Detectives did not waste much time tracking down her mother, Margarita Castillo, not far from her daughter, Lorena. Margarita at the time resided in Washington Heights in Queens, New York. However, as eager as investigators were to talk to her, Margarita did not reciprocate the same feelings. She was not interested to talk to the investigators and turned them down before the investigators legally obtained an envelope that had Margarita's DNA on it. The test results of this DNA came back with the answer detectives had been searching for over 2 decades. Margarita Castillo was the biological mother of baby Hope. With tears in her eyes, Margarita agreed to talk only when she saw the DNA result and the composite sketch of baby Hope. Margarita let the investigators know that baby Hope was indeed her long-lost daughter, Angelica Castillo. After decades of lying nameless in a Manhattan cemetery, baby Hope finally got her name back. However, this revelation created more questions than answers. One of the most significant of them was why Margarita would never report her daughter missing in the first place. Claiming that she only acted that way because she had no knowledge of Angelica being missing, Margarita began to tell the investigators the story of how she became estranged from her own daughter. Angelica was born on April 24, 1987, to her mother, Margarita Castillo, and her father, Genaro Ramirez. Despite having several children, the couple's marital life was rocky, as Margarita was scared of Genaro, who had a reputation for being abusive. Just after a few years of Angelica's birth, Margarita and Genaro separated as a result of their regular fights. According to Margarita, it was after one of those fights in 1991 that she took her 3 daughters with her and left the home. The next day, Genaro called her saying that he wanted to meet his daughters. Though still angry due to his behavior, Margarita accepted, considering Genaro was still the father of the girls. As per Genaro's instructions, Margarita brought the girls to the house of his adult niece, where he was already present. After spending the night there, Margarita decided to leave the next day, when Genaro had a strange request for her. He wanted her to leave their 2 younger daughters, Angelica and Maribel, with him and take the older Lorena with her. Margarita, who was well aware of his violent nature, knew that it was not just a request but a threat. Despite not agreeing to the arrangement, Margarita left her younger daughters with him. Margarita also said that she often visited the girls after being forced to leave them with their father and brought them little gifts. During one visit, when she saw that her estranged husband wasn't around, she asked the niece, Velvina Juarez Ramirez, if she could take her kids back, which Velvina rejected, saying that her uncle would be upset if she let the kids go. Margarita claimed that she kept visiting the place until one day the family moved, without informing her or leaving any address. Margarita had no idea where her estranged husband or daughters were. In 1995, 4 years after baby Hope's remains were found, Margarita got a call from a woman saying that Belvina had passed away. Margarita headed to the location and inquired about her daughters after giving her condolences to the deceased. Unfortunately, nobody in the family told her about the whereabouts of her 2 daughters, and she came home empty-handed. It was only later that another call from the same woman requesting her to pick up her daughter, referring only to Maribel, that she realized that there was something terribly wrong. She was then informed that Maribel was the only daughter who had been there all along, while nobody had any clue where Angelica was. Although Margarita suspected Genaro of being responsible for Angelica's disappearance, she never went to the police to report her daughter missing. Asserting an explanation for her actions, Margarita said that since her family had illegally immigrated from Mexico and she did not speak English and only spoke Spanish, she was scared to go to the police. Though Margarita accepted her fate, never taking a stand for her own daughter, detectives were dedicated to providing their precious baby Hope with justice. They now consider General Ramirez as the prime suspect in his daughter's disappearance and murder, and a massive search began for him. Unfortunately, to this day, no information about his whereabouts have come to light, as he continues to be a missing person. Yet some people, including Margarita, believe he fled the US and returned to his home country, Mexico. When tracking down Angelica's father failed, everyone thought the mystery of baby Hope's brutal murder would never be solved until police pointed their fingers at another man. The man was none other than Angelica's own cousin on her father's side and Belvina's brother. Then, 30-year-old Conrado Juarez Ramirez. Juarez was a regular visitor of the home where Angelica and Maribel were living under the care of Belvina and 5 other relatives in an apartment in Astoria, Queens. Juarez had a long criminal history comprising different kinds of crime, including sexual assault. Surprisingly, his family still let him hang around the children. Based on past records, NYPD detectives wanted to zero in on this guy and went looking for him. They waited in front of the Manhattan restaurant where he worked as a dishwasher and later brought him in for questioning. Although he was asked questions regarding Angelica's disappearance, detectives still suspected Angelica's father to be the one responsible until Juarez dropped a bombshell. After initially denying it a few hours into the questioning, 52-year-old Juarez began confessing to the murder. He revealed that in July 1991, he was visiting his sister, Belvina, in her Queens apartment, when one night he came back to find 4-year-old Angelica in the hallway in the middle of the night. Angelica was seemingly looking to go to the bathroom when Juarez took her by the hand into his room and she went with him. At some point, Juarez claimed that alcohol made him lose control and he tried to sexually molest her. And she started screaming. To keep her quiet, Juarez bound the little girl to the table, which was often done to her to stop her from getting food or water. He claimed that he did not intend to harm her and only suffocated her to stop her from crying. He then took a pillow and suffocated her until she went motionless. After he was done, he summoned his sister Belvina, who was in another room. Shocked by the incident, she began yelling at him, before quickly deciding they had to get rid of the body instead of notifying the police. Juarez claimed that it was Belvina who gave him a cooler that was in the garage and had a conversation about how they would fit the girl inside it. The very conversation Maribel had heard that night and later revealed to her sister. After binding Angelica's hands and feet, Juarez stuffed the lifeless body inside the cooler, almost in half, and placed Coke cans over it so that it wouldn't look suspicious. The pair then hailed a cab from Astoria to Washington Heights and disposed of the cooler in the wooded area where it was later discovered. Eerily, Juarez's confession perfectly aligned with the tip where a woman saw a Hispanic man and a Hispanic woman carrying a cooler a few days before the discovery, suggesting it was legit all along. Hoping that the remains would never be discovered, the pair parted their separate ways, never to talk about this again. In 1995, Belvina died, taking the disturbing secret to her grave, while Juarez went on with his life as if nothing happened. In this interview with police, Juarez also revealed that Angelica was mistreated and tortured at the hands of Belvina and her family on a regular basis for the last 2 years of her life. From starving to being harshly punished, the little girl went through an unspeakable amount of suffering in her already short life. It was finally time for her to get justice as investigators took Juarez into their custody and charged him with first-degree murder. Police would later learn that at one time when Margarita demanded that Juarez let her see her girls, Juarez responded by saying that when he returned from Mexico, there was only one girl and that the other girl was dead. Detectives who had held baby Hope close to their hearts all those years were disgusted by the fact that even after that, or looked for her daughter. When the mother was asked in an interview what she would say to her dead daughter, she replied, "I would ask her to forgive me, that I wish I could have stopped him before he could hurt her." Unfortunately, after initially confessing to Angelica's murder, Conrado Juarez Ramirez recanted his words. This time, he claimed that his sister, Belvina, called him on a cell phone one night in July 1991, describing that Angelica had fallen down the stairs and she needed his help to dispose of her body. He then admitted that he helped her bind the child's body. Then he and Belvina drove to the Henry Hudson Parkway where they dumped her body. After the recantation, prosecutors were having a hard time building a case against him. They were worried due to no forensic evidence linking Juarez to the murder. After Belvina's death, there was no potential witness either. While the investigators persisted that he described many things that only a killer would know, the defense focused more on the forensic evidence. Eventually, the case would come to conclusion after 22 years of a long battle, but not in a way anybody would have wanted. While in jail in 2018, 52-year-old Conrado Juarez Ramirez passed away after falling ill, pending his trial in Manhattan Supreme Court the following year. The case was officially closed after the only suspect was killed. As for Angelica's father, investigators concluded that although he might have other potential victims of his own, he was most likely unaware of his daughter's fate once he left home and never came back. There is no doubt that this poor 4-year-old girl had been through a lot before tragically being murdered and left to rot. Yet, it's amazing to see strangers pouring out their love for her while her own family failed and betrayed her. We can only hope that the little one could rest in peace with her name on her gravestone after 2 decades. Do you think that her death could have been prevented if her mother intervened? What do you think about it? Tell us your thoughts in comments below. Let's continue. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Rick Hazelton grew up on May Street in Glens Falls, New York. In October 1986, at 23 years old, he decided to move to New York City to pursue a career in music. His relationships with family were strained, and many of his childhood friends had moved away or started their own families. They were excited for Rick's new adventure, but became worried when he didn't keep in touch after leaving. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find any trace of Rick in the years that followed his departure from Glens Falls. Several years after Rick disappeared, his family had him declared legally dead. Brian Pinchin had been Rick's best friend. The two had been inseparable, spending every day together. And Brian considered Rick his brother, rather than simply a friend. Brian went on to become a police officer in Fort Edward, New York, and retired after 25 years of service. Over the years, he would lie awake at night, thinking about Rick, haunted by the thought of never knowing what had happened to his childhood friend. He spent years working on the case in his spare time. He decided to dedicate the extra time his retirement freed up to further working on his investigation and learning what had become of Rick Hazelton. Brian looked up records and scoured databases of unidentified remains. He eventually got in contact with a detective in Nashville, Tennessee, when he found a sketch of a man he thought could have been Rick. It would be this relationship that would finally get Brian answers about what happened to Rick after he left Glens Falls. Rick did not die as his friends, family, and the courts believed. Rick had spent several months in Miami. While he was there, he saw an ad in a newspaper for cheap airfare and spent $80 on a ticket to Denver. From there, he hitchhiked to western Colorado, where he met the woman who would eventually become his wife. The couple had 2 children. In 2001, Rick and his family moved to Oregon to be closer to his wife's family. Rick never contacted anyone back in his hometown because he did not believe anyone would want him to. "I didn't think anybody really cared, so I just made my own life and did it," he would eventually tell reporters. He did not know how wrong he was or how many of his friends had looked for him over the years. He did not understand that his abrupt disappearance from his loved ones' lives would result in an investigation that would ultimately end in him being declared legally dead, or the years of heartache it caused the people who loved him. That finally changed in August of 2019, when a missing persons case was opened in Nashville. Based on Brian's theory that Rick may have died there, Rick received a letter in the mail informing him that he was being investigated as a missing person. He at first thought the letter was a mistake, but then learned that there were still people back in Glens Falls who cared about him. Rick and Brian were able to exchange letters and then speak on the phone. Rick was able to save up enough money to travel back to New York State in November of 2019. He planned to spend several weeks with the various friends and family members he had not spoken with in 33 years, and then celebrate Thanksgiving with them. On November 17th, he and a large group of his childhood friends reunited at the playground where they all used to play together for a game of kickball. Brian Pinchin is very happy to have finally found his old friend and encourages others who are looking for a missing loved one to keep fighting for answers. "If you love somebody, don't ever give up on them," he said after his reunion with Rick. "If you don't have an answer, keep going until you can find out what actually happened." 21-year-old Riley Zickel, originally from California, was living in Portland, Oregon, and attending Lewis and Clark College, where he was majoring in chemistry and minoring in music. He loved the outdoors and was an experienced hiker. On Wednesday, July 27, 2016, Riley told his family that he was planning to spend the day exploring the Mount Jefferson Wilderness area southeast of Portland. He was going to camp there that night, and then drive up to the Seattle area on the 28th to meet up with friends so that they could go on another hike. The last known sighting of Riley was on the 27th, when he stopped to talk with another hiker on his way into the wilderness. Marion County Sheriff's deputies found Riley's silver Mazda parked near a trailhead for the Pacific Crest Trail that went into the wilderness area on July 30th. The same day, Riley's family reported him missing. They had become concerned when Riley had not shown up for plans he had made that day. The sheriff's office attempted to ping Riley's cell phone, but were unsuccessful, and believed that Riley had turned it off. It does appear that Riley had his cell phone with him when he traveled to the area, because the friends he had planned to meet near Seattle canceled their plans sometime after Riley talked to his family, and he told a friend that he would be extending his stay near Mount Jefferson. Given the unreliability of cell service in remote areas, it makes sense that Riley may have turned off his phone during his hike. Riley had 4 days' worth of food, a water filtration device, and camping equipment with him when he went into the wilderness area. So there was still hope that he was alive on July 31st, when the formal search for him began. The search team initially consisted of 45 people, but more than 340 people would ultimately assist in the effort. Sheriff's deputies from 4 additional counties, the Army National Guard, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Civil Air Patrol all also contributed to the search, which covered more than 350 square miles. On August 1st, the sheriff's office received a potential clue. A hiker came forward with a photograph they had taken on July 29th. The photograph showed a man standing outside a tent at Sprague Lake. Riley's family believed it could have been him, and the tent was similar to the one Riley was believed to have taken with him. Unfortunately, 2 days later, a man came forward, identifying himself as the individual in the picture, leaving investigators without what they had thought was a promising lead. The official search went on for more than a week, far longer than typical search efforts, because Riley had the equipment and knowledge to survive outdoors, even after the official search ended. Authorities still followed up on leads from unofficial sources. A private helicopter pilot helping the Zickel family was able to provide the sheriff's office with a new location to search, in a crevice in the Jefferson Glacier, based on his own flights looking for Riley. The location was searched, but nothing was found. While Riley had been equipped to survive for several days when he went into the wilderness, he could not have survived there indefinitely. That he most likely passed away, somewhere too remote for them to find him. On October 23, 2016, Riley's family held a memorial service for him in Petaluma, California. In 2017, the Riley Zickel Endowed Music Scholarship was established to help music students finance their education at Lewis and Clark, informing them that they had seen human remains in a glacial area above Jefferson Park on Mount Jefferson. Based on the personal effects that were with the remains, they believed that they belonged to Riley Zickel. The area where Riley was found had been searched back in 2016. Riley's clothing and equipment blended in with the surroundings. However, the main reason the initial search did not help locate him was because of how dangerous the area was. The terrain in that area was very steep and many of the rocks were loose, which made it prone to rock slides, so it was an exceptionally difficult area to safely search. The nature of the location also complicated the recovery of Riley's remains. However, on September 3, 2019, Marion County Search and Rescue Squad, Corvallis Mountain Rescue, the Civil Air Patrol, and the U.S. Forest Service all participated in a joint recovery effort. Riley's father, Robin, was waiting at the trailhead when the team brought his son down from the mountain 3 years after he went missing. Riley's remains were taken to the medical examiner's office. On October 15th, the medical examiner positively identified the remains as Riley Zickel and released them to Riley's family, while Riley's loved ones had prepared themselves for the reality of Riley's death. Locating his remains was still of the utmost importance to them, because it both helped them honor Riley and helped them cope. I believe that when you suffer a loss, you learn to live with it. You never get over it, but you learn to live with it. Robin Zickel told the Press-Democrat after his son was found, "I was not able to learn to live with not knowing what happened." Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Hugh Turner was from Alberta, Canada, but he and his wife of more than 50 years, Joyce, spent the winter months at a home they owned in Mesa, Arizona. Even at 85 years of age, Hugh remained very active, working out 3 days a week, playing golf regularly, and taking daily walks around his neighborhood in the Red Mountain Ranch neighborhood in East Mesa. He left for one of these walks around noon on Christmas Eve of 2010. He never came home. A massive search was conducted to try to find Hugh. Hundreds of volunteers came out to assist members of law enforcement and area search and rescue groups in the effort to locate him. No sign of Hugh or any clues to his whereabouts were found during these searches. Hugh was mentally still very sharp, but his behavior on the morning of his disappearance may have indicated that he was beginning to have memory problems. That morning, he had attended a Christmas party and reportedly went up to a woman and asked her where he was. This raised concerns that Hugh may have been experiencing early signs of dementia at the time of his disappearance. Hugh's wife and 4 children struggled to cope with the void his disappearance left in their lives and the unease they felt at not knowing what happened to him. Joyce Turner was very lonely without her husband, but continued to return to their home in Mesa every winter. 2019, a hiker was near Red Mountain on the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community when they came across a set of human remains. They notified the authorities, who believed that the remains were Hugh Turner, based on the personal effects found with them. This suspicion was confirmed on January 10th, when the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office positively identified the remains as Hugh, based on his dental records. The location where Hugh was found was approximately 4 miles north of his home. While Hugh's family told authorities that he was physically capable of walking great distances, this area had not been covered in the initial 2010 search. To reach it, Hugh would have had to cross a canal and make his way up very steep terrain. The report from the medical examiner's office did not list a cause of death, but police do not suspect foul play in the case. While Hugh's death is obviously difficult for his family, they are also grateful to finally have answers. "I don't think any of us had thought we were ever going to know what happened to our father," said Hugh's daughter, Janice McCaffrey, after his remains were discovered. "And I've kind of figured that, as sad as it is, we just won the cold case missing persons lottery and someone found him. And that in itself is a miracle." 73-year-old Susie Thomasai was a beloved mother and grandmother who lived in Lakewood Park, Florida, with her husband Patrick. The couple owned 2 restaurants together. They were at one of these restaurants, the Quilted Giraffe on US Route 1 in Vero Beach, on March 16, 2018. It was a hectic Friday night and the restaurant was short-staffed, so Patrick was busy running around doing multiple tasks. Susie had a form of dementia, so she did not work as actively at the restaurant as her husband, but she still spent every day there with him. Patrick last saw his wife on the restaurant's back porch, where she liked to go out to read. He went back inside the restaurant to take a phone call. When he came back outside, Susie was gone. Susie loved talking to people and often visited South Bureau Square, the shopping center just south of the restaurant. Patrick searched up and down the center for his wife, but could not find her. He and one of his customers then got into a car and drove around looking for her. He went back to their home, but Susie had not returned there. At 6:48 p.m., he called the police. An extensive search of the immediate area did not locate Susie. The sheriff's office used a helicopter to search for her from the air, and her family searched on foot all night. Authorities believe she must have gotten into a vehicle in order to get so far from the restaurant in such a short period of time. Surveillance footage would confirm that Susie had gone to South Vero Square shortly after being last seen by Patrick. The footage shows that around 5:40 p.m., she was walking along the shopping center with a cigarette in her hand. Authorities speculate that she may have been asking passersby for a lighter. She walked out of range of the cameras at the southern end of the shopping center, and police could not trace her path any further. Dozens of volunteers came out to search a nearby wooded area, and potential sightings of Susie began coming in to the authorities. These potential sightings were all over Florida and as far away as New Jersey. Within the first 6 months after Susie's disappearance, the sheriff's office had followed up on more than 100 leads. None of them helped locate Susie. After Susie went missing, Patrick Tomasi decided to shut down the Quilted Giraffe for the summer, in order to focus on the search for her. When the summer ended and Susie still had not been found, he decided to make the closure permanent. It was too painful for him to be there without Susie. He auctioned off the restaurant's equipment and sold the property. The restaurant was demolished and new medical buildings were constructed where it once stood. Susie had been missing for more than a year and a half when authorities finally had a new potential clue to present to the public. In October of 2019, the Indian River County Sheriff's Office released new surveillance footage taken the day Susie went missing, not far from where she was last seen. The footage, taken at 6:04 p.m., appears to show someone on foot walking up to a white truck and speaking to the driver. The person on foot then walks around the front of the truck and gets into the passenger side of the vehicle. Despite the poor quality of the footage, Patrick Tomasi believes that Susie is the person on foot who gets into the truck. The sheriff's department is hoping that even though this new footage is of poor quality, it will help identify new potential witnesses to interview and leads to follow. The Tomasi family is still offering a $15,000 reward for Susie's safe return. 27-year-old Zachary Wilkes lived in Lompoc, California, and worked as a handyman. His parents had moved to the Washington, D.C. metro area, but Zachary and his younger brother Andrew remained living in the family home in California. He had a kind heart and was always willing to help people, whether they were his neighbors or strangers in need. Zachary had an aunt and uncle who lived in Las Vegas, but had a houseboat on Lake Powell. Every year, either Zachary or one of his two brothers would travel to help them do work on the houseboat to get it ready for the summer. In 2017, Zachary would be making the trip. He had been looking forward to it because while he would be doing work, he enjoyed spending time on the lake. Andrew and a group of friends saw Zachary leave for the 7-hour drive to Las Vegas at 11 p.m. on May 24, 2017. Because he was leaving so late at night, Zachary would not arrive at his destination until very early in the morning. He told Andrew that he planned to stop at a casino once he arrived in Las Vegas to kill some time so that he would not show up at their aunt and uncle's house too early. Zachary never made it to his aunt and uncle's house, and no one in his family could get a hold of him on his cell phone when they tried calling him after he failed to arrive. His brother Andrew reported him missing on May 26th. Zachary's family drove back and forth between Las Vegas and Lompoc, looking for signs of Zachary or his black 1994 Honda Civic. They checked every route he could have taken, which involved searching 6 different highways. When they received Zachary's cell phone records, they learned that his phone had pinged on a cell phone tower that would have placed him on Highway 166. The time and location of the ping showed that Zachary's drive had been going according to plan. The Wilkes family then hired a private contractor to fly search and rescue drones over the 6-mile radius of the cell phone tower and use their cameras to look for Zachary or the car. Teams searched remote side roads, campgrounds, and parts of the Los Padres National Forest. None of these efforts located Zachary or his vehicle. Around the time Zachary went missing, there was speculation that he may have left of his own accord to start a new life. He reportedly did not like living in a smaller city and had a desire to move to a bigger one. However, Zachary already had plans to move to a more metropolitan area. He had told both his mother and father that he was going to move in with them in their house just outside of Washington, D.C., as he had been welcomed to ever since they first moved there. Since he already had public plans to leave Lompoc, it is hard to understand why he would choose to leave in secret instead. Furthermore, it does not seem possible that Zachary could have funded such a move, as he left all of his money in his bank account and has not accessed any of his financial accounts since he was last seen. The mystery of Zachary's disappearance appeared to be solved in 2019. On October 25th, his Honda Civic was found upside down in a culvert off of Highway 166. According to the Lompoc police, the vehicle was involved in a traffic collision causing and ended up in the dense brush off the side of the roadway. Based on the amount and type of damage, they believe that the car was in motion at the time of the accident. Police believe that the car had been in the culvert since around the time Zachary went missing, and that there were no other vehicles involved in the accident. The car is still being examined for signs of mechanical failure that may have contributed to the crash. However, Zachary's remains were not in the car. Multiple agencies searched the area again in hopes of finding them, but were unsuccessful. While the discovery of the car provides new information about the case, it also adds to the mystery of it. Zachary's family is still hoping for answers in his disappearance, and that locating his vehicle will help provide them. On January 18, 1971, 19-year-old Christine Christie Easton called her friend Sandy and asked her to go shopping with her. Sandy said yes, and Christie picked her up in a blue 1969 Ford Maverick. The car belonged to Christie's ex-boyfriend, who had agreed to let her borrow it. Christie and Sandy went to a Mervyn's department store, where Christie bought a pair of boots she had been saving up for. Christie made a quick trip back to her own house in Hayward, California to take a shower. She then went out again to go to Charlie's Car Wash on Mission Boulevard. In exchange for borrowing the car, Christie had promised her ex-boyfriend that she would wash it before coming to pick him up at the Jack in the Box restaurant where he worked at the end of his shift. Christie never arrived at the restaurant as planned, however. Her ex-boyfriend called her family home to see if anyone knew where she was. Her family knew that Christie had left to meet him, and that something must have happened to her if she did not arrive at her intended destination. They went out to begin searching for her. In the early morning of January 19th, they found the Maverick Christie had been driving at the car wash, parked near the vacuums. Christie was not with the vehicle. Her scarf and purse were left on the front seat, and papers that had been inside the car were scattered on the ground. These papers gave rise to conflicting theories about Christie's disappearance. At first glance, they seemed to be a sign of a struggle. However, at least one of the original police officers from the case believed that the papers had been scattered on purpose to make it appear as though there had been a struggle. Because of her age, police originally believed that Christie had run off on her own accord. Her family was positive that they were wrong. On a pragmatic level, all of Christie's belongings were left either in the car or at her home. Furthermore, she was enrolled in classes at a local college and was due to start a new job at a bank that she was very excited about the day after she went missing. They also believed that running away was not in line with Christie's personality or past behavior. Christie had never run with a dangerous crowd or experimented with drugs. In 1970, she had graduated from Sunset High, where she had been a song girl, homecoming queen, and an active member of the theater department. She had a kind and loving personality. Her family feared that Christie's beauty may have made her a target for a predator. Christie's case was cold for decades. A new witness finally came forward in 2019, after the case was featured in the local media. The Easton family's initial concerns appear to have been correct. The witness believed that they had unknowingly witnessed Christie being abducted by two men. The witness had not realized what they were seeing in 1971. They saw two men in a white Ford van with distinctive side mirrors, sometimes called West Coast mirrors. One man was in the driver's seat and the other was putting a girl in the back of the van. The witness only saw the man putting Christie in the van from behind, but did get a passing glance at the driver of the van. Police released a sketch of the van's driver, created with the help of the new witness. They hope that the sketch will help finally get answers in what is the oldest missing persons case in Hayward. Even though it has been nearly 50 years since Christie went missing, there is still a $50,000 reward for information in Christie's case. Virginia was born in 1926 to Helen and Thomas Hannon in Malden, Massachusetts. She was the oldest of four siblings, with two brothers, Paul and Thomas, and a sister named Barbara. After marrying, Virginia moved to Pembroke with her husband and enjoyed a happy life until he passed away in 1971. After his death, Virginia lived alone in their cozy cottage. Known for her kindness and helpfulness, Virginia was well known in her community. She looked after stray dogs in her neighborhood, regularly feeding and caring for them. Nobody went hungry under her care. Before that, a small update. Every time someone visited her, she would provide them with plenty of drinks, homemade cookies, and other baked delicacies. It didn't matter to her if they were new or were already known to her. After working for many years as a cook and lunch lady at Bryantville Elementary School in Pembroke, Virginia, She was on the verge of retirement in late 1983. Virginia's stepfather, who also lived in the neighborhood, was one of the people she cared for most. She would prepare his lunch and bring it to him every day. However, for 2 consecutive days in February 1984, lunchtime came and went, and Virginia was nowhere to be seen. Finally, on February 13th, her stepfather's housekeeper called her multiple times before deciding to visit her home to see if everything was okay after numerous unsuccessful attempts to get in touch with her. He entered her house just to retrieve an extra key from her, but instead he discovered Virginia on her bed, having been brutally murdered. The housekeeper was so shocked that he could not even think clearly as to what action to take next. Virginia had multiple wounds clearly visible on her body, and she was partially covered by her blanket. Hearing the screams of the housekeeper, a few of the neighbors came to see what all the commotion was about. They too were stunned, seeing Virginia's lifeless form. Everyone in the community was shocked at Virginia's passing because she was so well liked by the majority of people who knew her, and none of them could imagine someone harming Virginia. Then, without wasting any more time, the housekeeper called the police. The area around West Street was a very quiet place to live. Even the newest family had been there for more than 10 years. However, on that day, all the activity made people question why the Pembroke police were in their neighborhood. People slowly began to find out that their neighbor, Virginia Hannon, had been found dead in her bed. When the police walked into the cottage and saw the body, even the most experienced of them was speechless. They were left in disbelief by the brutality of the scene. I think it was the most brutal murder we've had in the history of Pembroke. She was assaulted, she was kicked, she was punched. She was stabbed and she was strangled with a pair of her own stockings, said one of the officers of Pembroke Police Department. The investigator looked around and saw someone had messed with the front door and the window. It likely meant that the killer had broken into the house. When Virginia wouldn't let them in, this could have been why they robbed and attacked her. There was also a shoe print on her stomach, which led police to think that the person who killed her might have kicked her as they killed her. The police knew that Virginia lived on her own, so before they talked to her family, they talked to her neighbors and friends who lived close by. The neighbors told the police there wasn't a single reason someone would want to hurt Virginia. After interviewing a large number of people, the police found that Dolly Smith was the last person to see Virginia alive. Virginia and Dolly were extremely close friends and had been so for a very long time. She had last seen Virginia on February 11, 1984, according to Dolly. It was a Saturday and Virginia and Dolly had planned to go to church as they usually did. Dolly said that she and Virginia had visited St. Joseph's Church together that evening. The distance from Virginia's house to the church was roughly 4 miles, and the evening mass started at 5 p.m. as usual. After church, the two women had gone to BR's restaurant, a place they frequently visited after church. The restaurant was roughly 7 miles from the church, and they had dinner before leaving. It was around 7:30 when Dolly dropped Virginia off at her house. Other than the murderer, Dolly was the last person to see Virginia alive. Dolly also said that Virginia had difficulty breathing when climbing the stairs to her house. This was because Virginia had emphysema, which caused her to have breathing problems while engaging in any physical activity. Dolly also informed the police that she had seen Virginia carrying $100 when she dropped her off. But the money was missing from Virginia's wallet when the investigators searched for it. On both Saturday and Sunday, the neighbors did not hear or see anything. They heard nothing unusual or anything that would have suggested a struggle. According to the autopsy, shortly after she returned home from church on Saturday was when she was murdered. As the police continued their investigations, they learned about Virginia's aunt, who had lived in California before she passed away. When she died, she had left a huge sum of $380,000 to Virginia. Virginia was considering taking an early retirement from her position as the elementary school's cook and lunch lady after receiving this inheritance. Virginia never showed off her newfound wealth, although she did tell a few people about it, according to her nephew. She was not embarrassed to talk about the money her wealthy aunt had left her as an inheritance. She was a very honest person and would answer questions from anyone. She was the kind of person who would chat with total strangers and share details about her life. She had also kept a portion of the money at her house, though she deposited most of it in a bank. Those who knew Virginia well claimed that the murderer may have believed that she had money hidden in her house and that this was the reason someone broke into her home. The investigators spoke with more than 50 people, but they were unable to get any fresh leads in the case. Without any clues or leads, the case soon turned cold, and it looked like the police might never be able to figure out who did it. Her family tried to keep the story alive and in the public eye by regularly speaking to the media. The Pembroke Police Department also kept looking at the case. Investigators held a vigil in 2019 to mark the 35th anniversary of Virginia's death. With advances in technology, they also found that the DNA samples they took from the crime scene all came from the same person. The only thing that was sure was that the DNA was from a man, but they didn't know who he was. They tried to find the suspect through forensic genealogy, but it didn't work because there was nothing to compare it to. So Virginia's case was again put on hold. Virginia's murderer was unidentified until an individual called the Pembroke Police Department on February 4, 2020. The individual informed the police that Jesse Aylward, his friend, had confessed to killing Virginia Hannon in Pembroke in 1984. Police discovered that Jesse Aylward, 58, had passed away the previous day on February 3, 2020. With the help of this information, the police were able to secure a warrant, locate Aylward's body at Brockton Hospital, and take a blood sample. After that, they discovered a match between his DNA and 3 pieces of evidence discovered at the crime scene. The 3 pieces of evidence were the nylon stockings that were used to strangle Virginia Hannon, the shattered glass, and the bloodied paper towels. Jesse was about 22 years old when Virginia passed away. In March 2021, the Plymouth District Attorney's Office made the information public. Virginia most likely did not know him, which is why she refused to let him inside her home. But the detectives did confirm that there were no known ties between Jesse and Virginia. But at the time of the murder, he had resided near her house. Although Aylward had a criminal history that included some violent behavior, the police had not suspected him during the initial investigation. The victim's devastated relatives thanked the police for their unwavering efforts, but they said that the news was bittersweet because it came after the suspect's passing. "I'm so glad they finally have someone," Judy Hannon said. "Would I like to see him go in handcuffs? Yes, because that's what he deserves." Considering the advancements that have been made in forensic technology, this case does give hope to many people who have loved ones who have been separated from their family for a long time. These technologies could assist in solving a significant number of unsolved mysteries from the years gone by. Mandy Stavik was a remarkable person who excelled in many areas. While attending M.T. Baker High School, she was an honors student involved in varsity basketball, varsity softball, and track. She was also fluent in sign language and Japanese, and she played 3 musical instruments: clarinet, flute, and saxophone in the school band. Mandy was known for her bravery, independence, and drive. In 1989, Mandy graduated from high school at 18 years old and enrolled at Central Washington University. Initially aiming to become a commercial pilot, she started reconsidering her career plans during her first semester of college. That November, she returned to her family home in Clipper, Washington, just outside the small town of Acme, for her Thanksgiving break. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24, 1989, Mandy decided to go for a run and left the house around 2:30 in the afternoon. Normally, her mother Mary would ride her bike alongside Mandy while she ran. But on that day, Mary decided to stay home because her sister was visiting. Mandy was accompanied on her run by just the family dog, a German shepherd named Kyra. At home, Mandy's route for her daily runs took her down the street her family's house was on, Strand Road. She would run down to where the road dead ended at the Nooksack River and then turn around to run home. Mandy's brother, Lee, had been visiting a friend that afternoon at a house on Strand Road between Highway 9 and the Stavik home. While he was there, he saw his sister running by on her way back to their house. She had less than half a mile to go before she would reach it, but Mandy never arrived home. 2 hours later, Kyra arrived back at the house, without Mandy and visibly upset. Mary Stavik's first instinct was to call Mandy's boyfriend, Rick Sender, to see if he knew where she was. He did not. She then called the sheriff and everyone she knew in the area to begin the search for Mandy. Almost every member of the small rural community eventually helped look for Mandy. People searched on foot, on horseback, and on all-terrain vehicles. A local tracker tried to work with Kyra, the German shepherd, hoping that she would lead them back to Mandy. However, Kyra would cower in fear upon stepping off of the porch of the family home. Kyra was an older dog, but still very protective of her family. She may have been kicked or hit when she tried to defend Mandy against an assailant, resulting in the change in her behavior when she arrived home. On November 26th, a search team covering small side roads discovered a pair of green sweatpants. Mandy had been wearing teal sweatpants and a light-colored sweatshirt when she left for her run. Mary Stavik did not believe that the sweatpants the search team found belonged to her daughter, but they were still submitted to the crime lab for analysis. Lab tests would eventually show that the pants were unrelated to the case. The following day, November 27, 1989, Mandy was finally found, but the discovery did not bring her family peace. A local fire department had been searching the Nooksack River with one of their boats. They located Mandy's body in the South Fork of the river, caught up in some debris 6 miles away from her home. She was wearing only her socks and shoes. Her clothing and the Walkman she had been using on her run have never been found. An autopsy would later determine that Mandy had been raped and that she had died from there were no signs of a struggle on the riverbank near where she was found, and the water was very shallow in that stretch of the river. Mandy was also a very strong swimmer who had worked as a lifeguard. These factors led investigators to believe that Mandy had not been conscious when she went into the water. This was further supported by a wound on the top of her head that the medical examiner believed would have rendered her unconscious. Mandy also had numerous scratches and lacerations on her legs, as though she had run through dense brush or the thorny blackberry bushes that were common in the area while not wearing pants. Unfortunately, Mandy was not the first of her siblings to be murdered. In 1975, her oldest brother Brent had been killed on property owned by the Fort Richardson Army Base just outside of Anchorage, where he was authorized to go hunting. He had been shot 17 times. His killer has still never been found. Mandy, her mother, and her 2 remaining siblings then moved to Washington State from Alaska while Mandy was still very young, following her parents' divorce. More than 1,000 people attended Mandy's memorial service. There was not a church in the area large enough to hold that many people, so the service was held at the high school Mandy had graduated from just a few months before. The obvious first suspect in the case was Mandy's boyfriend, Rick. The couple had been dating for 3.5 years, but the relationship was on and off for some of that time. However, Rick was eager to cooperate with police, who described him as being extremely forthcoming when he gave his statement to them. He was eventually cleared of any involvement in the case. In 1989, DNA testing was still a relatively new technique, especially in the criminal justice field. Luckily for the Stavik family, Ron Peterson of the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office had just returned from a training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, about how DNA could be used by law enforcement. Most state and local crime labs were not equipped to identify and sequence DNA evidence, but the FBI's lab was. Samples from Mandy's body were sent to the FBI lab, and they were able to isolate Mandy's DNA sequence and that of an unknown male. Investigators followed up on more than 7,000 leads and tried to connect Mandy's case to other crimes all over the Northwest. But the case still went cold. In 2009, Detective Kevin Bowie inherited the case, becoming the 3rd person to lead the investigation. His strategy for trying to solve the now 20-year-old case, inspired by a famous case in England, was simple. Identify all of the men living in the area at the time of the murder, and test all of their DNA until they found a match. Because Mandy had lived in a rural area with a small population, this theoretically could be done. In practice, however, it was obviously much more difficult to do. Over the next 4 years, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office was able to test dozens of DNA samples, but none of them were a match to the DNA from the crime scene. However, around this time, they were also able to identify a potential new suspect, who had never spoken to the police about the case, Timothy Bass. Timothy Bass had lived a few doors down from the Stabiks in 1989. People who knew him then have said that he was very quiet and kept to himself. He had moved away shortly after Mandy's murder and had gotten married just 2 months after her death. By 2013, he and his wife had 3 children and were living in Everson, Washington. Investigators traveled to Everson to speak with Timothy about the case. He claimed to not remember it or Mandy's name. This made the investigators immediately suspicious of him. Mandy's murder had been major news in her small and previously very safe town. Mandy had also gone to the same high school as Timothy and had been friends with his younger brother Tom. A witness would later reveal that Timothy had also started attending basketball games at the high school. When Mandy was on the team to watch her play, Mandy also ran past his house almost every single day when she was not at college. Timothy refused to provide a voluntary DNA sample. Police, however, still wanted to compare Timothy Bass's DNA to the DNA from the crime scene, so they went to his employer to ask for help. Timothy worked as a local delivery driver for the France bakery outlet. Investigators met with Kim Wagner, who managed the outlet. They told her that they were investigating an employee and wanted access to information about their delivery routes so that they could follow the employee and potentially collect a cigarette butt or some other discarded item with DNA on it. Kim felt as though she was not in a position to comply with this request and asked the investigators to consult with human resources at their corporate office. The corporate office in turn asked for a subpoena or search warrant to share that information. Authorities asked Tim Bass for a voluntary sample again in 2015, and again he refused. A few years after her conversation with the police, an offhand remark would change Kim Wagner's mind about getting involved in the case. She and her husband were out at a bar, talking with a friend about her co-workers. The friend happened to be an acquaintance of Timothy Bass, and the group began discussing his eccentricities. The friend mentioned to Kim that Timothy had lived on the same street as Mandy Stavik when she was killed. Kim then realized that Timothy and the Mandy Stavik case must have been the reason investigators had come to speak with her in 2013. When authorities returned to try to get information from the bakery outlet again in 2017, Kim confronted them with her suspicions about what they were investigating. She also told them Timothy Bass's assigned delivery route. But this information did not immediately help the authorities get Timothy's DNA. He wore gloves, so his DNA was not left on any of the bread he delivered, and he did not smoke, so he never discarded cigarette butts. He took his trash home instead of leaving it in his delivery truck, and he was the bakery's only employee who did not turn in his uniform to be laundered by the company. His conversations with police seemed to have concerned him enough that he carefully guarded any source of DNA that could be covertly collected. Kim Wagner offered to collect a discarded DNA sample from Timothy inside the bakery building. However, police told her that this would not be possible. It would be illegal for them to ask a civilian to collect evidence on their behalf. However, on August 10, 2017, Kim Wagner watched as Timothy Bass drank out of a plastic cup and discarded it in a trash can, along with a can of Coke. After he walked away, Kim decided to collect the items out of the trash can and hide them in a bag in her desk. She then turned the items over to the police. Kim was so motivated to help in the case because she, like the rest of the community, had been horrified by Mandy's murder. Kim was just 19 at the time of the murder, just 1 year older than Mandy. By 2017, Kim also had another reason for wanting the case to be closed. She had a daughter of her own, and was haunted by the idea of Mary Stavik never finding out who had taken her daughter from her. The evidence Kim provided was submitted to the crime lab for DNA testing. These tests showed that the DNA Timothy Bass left on the cup when he drank from it matched the DNA found inside of Mandy. Timothy Bass was arrested on December 12, 2017. On Mary Stavik's 81st birthday, knocked on her door and told her that an arrest had finally been made in her daughter's case. Following his arrest, Timothy Bass originally stuck to the story he had been giving to police since 2013. He did not know Mandy and he had never so much as kissed her. However, once it became clear to him that police had somehow gotten his DNA, he changed his story. He now claimed that he had a consensual sexual relationship with Mandy, which is why his DNA was on her body. Timothy claimed that he had met Mandy before she left for college, while he and his father were out mountain biking. His father had since passed away and could not confirm the story. Timothy says that he and Mandy began spending time together, just talking, and eventually began casually having sex. They had sex again when Mandy was home for Thanksgiving. Timothy could not, however, provide any basic information about Mandy, and not one witness was ever found who had seen the two of them together. There were no phone calls or letters between Mandy and Timothy after she left for college. Police did not believe Timothy's new story. Leading up to his trial, Timothy's defense lawyers tried to get all DNA evidence excluded. They argued that police had first obtained their client's DNA illegally because they asked a civilian to gather it for them. Police can legally collect items that someone has thrown away, but they cannot enlist civilians to do it for them. The lawyers argued that because Kim had previously met with authorities, she was acting on their behalf when she collected the cup and the can from the garbage. Kim Wagner appeared at a hearing and testified that collecting the items had been her own idea and that she had done it of her own accord. It is legal for civilians to turn over potential evidence that they legally obtain. Authorities. A judge ruled in August of 2018 that Kim had not been acting on behalf of law enforcement when she collected and turned over the items, and the DNA evidence remained admissible. When Timothy went on trial for first-degree murder in May of 2019, his defense was based on his claim that he had a consensual relationship with Mandy. The presence of his DNA inside of her body, his lawyers argued, therefore meant nothing. Timothy had no proof of this relationship, however, and as the trial progressed, it became more and more evident that his word did not carry a lot of value. Timothy's soon-to-be ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend at the time of Mandy's murder, testified that her husband, against whom she had previously applied for an order of protection, had threatened her into providing him with a false alibi for the day of the murder. It was also revealed that when Timothy's family came to visit him in jail after he had slipped them a note in which he asked his mother to lie to the police, telling them that he had been Christmas shopping with her the day of the murder. He also tried to convince his mother to blame the crime on his dead father. She would not let him. The most troubling testimony of all, however, came from Timothy's own brother, Tom. Tom Bass testified that in 2015, after authorities asked Timothy to volunteer a DNA sample for the second time, Timothy had asked him to lie to the police for him. Timothy told his younger brother that he had sex with Mandy the weekend of Thanksgiving. He wanted him to go to the police and say that he also had sex with Mandy. Timothy wanted to make it appear as though Mandy was, in his terms, a loose girl, so that the police would believe his story about him having consensual, casual sex with her. Tom, who had been friends with Mandy, refused to go along with the plan. On May 24, 2019, almost 30 years after Mandy's murder, a jury found Timothy Bass guilty of first-degree murder after less than a day of deliberation. Mary Stavik and the rest of Mandy's family was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. On July 2nd, a judge imposed the maximum sentence of 320 months, or almost 27 years, in prison. Timothy is planning to appeal his conviction. Every year since 1990, a scholarship has been awarded in Mandy's name to a Mount Baker High School student active in the school's music program. The funding for the scholarship includes the $25,000 the community raised to offer as a reward for information that led to the arrest of Mandy's killer. That money was donated to the scholarship fund after years had gone by with no arrest in the case. Even without the incentive of a reward, Mandy's case was finally solved. Thanks to the impact her life and death had on her community, and the persistence of Mandy's family and the investigators. Around 4:20 p.m. on November 7, 2015, an ambulance in Hereford, England, was en route to a hospital when it was stopped by 3 individuals on the road. Among them was an elderly man who appeared to have difficulty standing. He was accompanied by a younger man and a woman who had come across them near the Hereford bus station. They offered their assistance as the elderly man struggled to walk towards the hospital. Recognizing his frail condition and signs of possible dementia, paramedics decided to transport him the rest of the way to the hospital in the ambulance. He seemed to be smiling and crying simultaneously, and was seemingly unaware of his surroundings. He could not answer the basic questions asked of him, although he did eventually provide the first name Roger. The man who had been bringing him to the hospital also did not provide much information about himself. He refused to give his name and contact information because he claimed to be working at a nearby base of the Special Air Service, or SAS, an elite special forces unit of the British Army. He was dressed in what appeared to be some sort of military uniform and spoke with an American accent. He told officials that he had found the elderly man face down in a country lane near Creenan Hill, a village just outside of town. He left the hospital. Shortly after arriving there, the older man was still disoriented and could not provide any information about who he was or how he got to the area. He did eventually provide the full name of Roger Curry, but it was unclear if he meant that it was his name or the name of someone he knew. He had no form of identification on him or anything else that could help police determine his identity. He was dressed in all new clothes from a British department store, but police believed he was originally from North America. The man was very soft-spoken and difficult to understand when he was able to speak, but it was originally believed that he was Canadian based on his accent. A linguistics expert was eventually brought in to evaluate his accent, and they believed the man to be from the United States. The West Mercia police initially assumed that the man, who may or may not have been named Roger, would be identified quickly. When his worried family reported him missing, that report never came. Police looked into missing persons reports from all over the UK, as well as in Canada and the United States. They checked CCTV footage from the area, but found nothing to help their investigation. They took the man's fingerprints and DNA, but found no matches in any database, with no one looking for a man who clearly required close supervision. Doctors and police began to fear that he had been intentionally abandoned by his family. Authorities then appealed to the public to help identify the man, who would eventually become widely known as the Creenan Hill Man because of the location where he was allegedly found. The story was featured on local television and in newspapers, and eventually his story spread widely through social media. When none of these efforts resulted in an identification, the Creenan Hill Man was moved to Creenan Hill Court, a local care home that specializes in caring for dementia patients. He lived a peaceful life there, and the staff adored him. Their only complaint about him was that he would take more than his share of chocolate muffins. In 2016, still with no idea who the Creenan Hill Man was, authorities decided to launch another media campaign. The story was covered by the BBC and Sky News, reaching more people and garnering much more interest from the public. After seeing the story on the news, Rebecca Reese, the woman who had helped get the man to the hospital, came forward. Police briefly investigated her, thinking perhaps the Creenan Hill Man might have been Rebecca's husband, but she was soon clear of suspicion. The case of the Creenan Hill Man became a popular mystery online, with amateur sleuths from all around the world discussing it through social media. One such sleuth posted on the BBC West Midlands Facebook page, with an image from a 1958 high school yearbook. The yearbook was from Edmonds High School, just outside of Seattle, Washington, and the image was of 18-year-old Earl Roger Curry, who looked similar to the Creenan Hill Man and would be approximately the same age as he was believed to be. A reporter named Dara McIntyre was working on a documentary about missing people when he happened upon the case of the Creenan Hill Man and had the chance to meet him. He decided to travel to Washington State to follow up on the lead that had been posted on Facebook and would ultimately confirm the identity of the Creenan Hill Man. After graduating high school, Earl Roger Curry, who went by his middle name, served in the United States Air Force. He married a woman named Mary Jo, and the couple had 2 children. After leaving the Air Force, he worked as a nurse for Kaiser Permanente. He and his family lived in Whittier, California, a suburb of Los Angeles. Dara McIntyre traveled to Whittier and was able to speak to some of Roger Curry's neighbors. When they were shown pictures of the Creenan Hill Man, they confirmed that he was their former neighbor. Roger and Mary Jo no longer lived in the home because it had been badly damaged by a fire in 2014 and deemed uninhabitable by the city. However, in August of 2015, a neighbor had seen then 75-year-old Roger wandering around behind the chain-link fence that had been constructed around his property. There was a padlock securing the entrance to the fence, so the neighbor climbed over the fence to check on Roger. Roger's wife Mary Jo was also on the property, sleeping on an air mattress on the porch of the burnt-out home. The temperature that day was almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The couple did have a cooler with water and some food, but they were hardly strong enough to be living outdoors in such heat. Mary Jo had Parkinson's disease. Roger had Alzheimer's disease and could not care for himself. When police arrived on the scene, he was confused and dehydrated. Police would eventually discover that the food in the cooler was being brought to the Kais by their son, Kevin. The key to the padlock on the fence was found on his keychain, which would seem to imply that he had been the one who had locked his parents behind the fence, preventing them from leaving. However, Mary Jo told the police that it had been her idea for her and her husband to live behind what was left of their home, and no charges were ever filed against Kevin in relation to the matter. Kevin Curry had been charged with a number of criminal offenses, ranging from assault to fraud to burglary in his past, and had spent time in prison. He had been caring for his parents in 2015, but they had previously been estranged. In 2000, Roger Curry was granted a restraining order against his son after Kevin tried to strangle him, pushed him against a wall, and made several threats against him. According to neighbors, he still did not treat his parents well after he came back into their lives, as they could routinely hear him yelling and making loud noises in his parents' home. The circumstances of how Roger Curry arrived in the United Kingdom did not begin becoming clear to the police until March of 2016, when they finally heard from the mystery man, who had been trying to walk Roger to the hospital in Hereford. 50-year-old Simon Hayes called in to identify himself and provided an account very similar to the one he had given to the paramedics, who brought Roger to the hospital in 2015. Simon claimed that he had been a member of the Special Boat Service of the Royal Navy, attending a course at the SAS base in Hereford, when he and a Canadian Army serviceman found Roger face down in a country road. He told authorities that he was now living in Los Angeles, but was currently in the UK visiting family. After Simon provided a formal statement, authorities followed up on his account and went to speak with his father, Ken, in April of 2016. Ken informed them that his son was not visiting, he was living with him. He had previously lived in Los Angeles, but had been deported back to the UK in 2013. He also told them that Simon knew both Kevin and Roger Curry. Simon Hayes had moved to Los Angeles in 2003 to begin an American branch of his motorsport coaching business. He met Kevin Curry through a mutual friend, and the two men bonded over a shared interest in Area 51. They became close friends, and Simon spent the holidays with the Currys in 2010, seeing firsthand the effects Alzheimer's was already having on Kevin's father, Roger. Simon was deported in January of 2013, following an arrest for drunk driving. According to Simon, he was deported because his cellmate started a fight with him, and he was blamed for it. According to U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, he was deported because he had been in the country for 6 years on a 90-day visa waiver program. Upon his return to the United Kingdom, Simon immediately began applying for a visa to return to the United States. He supported his applications with a fraudulent reference. He claimed to be from a British major general that detailed a glorious military career that he did not ever have. All of his applications were denied. Simon and Kevin did remain in contact after Simon left the United States. Confronted by authorities with the fact that he knew the Curry family, Simon changed his story. He now admitted that his friend Kevin had called him to tell him that his family was about to take a European vacation, and that he wanted to stop in the UK to see him. Prior to his trip, Kevin said that he would be putting his parents in a nursing home for the time he would be out of the country. Simon claims that he was therefore surprised to see Mary Jo and Roger, who was so weak that he had to be brought out in a wheelchair when he met the family at Gatwick Airport. Simon denied that there was ever any plan to abandon Roger. Instead, Kevin asked Simon to help him get his father admitted to a hospital because he was sick. Simon agreed, and Kevin rented a car for him to use for the task. Prior to their departure, Kevin had borrowed Simon's credit card to do some shopping, which may have been when he purchased the new British clothes Roger was found wearing. Simon and Roger then drove 150 miles to Hereford, where Simon put on a fake uniform and American accent. There are several details about Simon's story and the actual events that call his claims of innocence into question. There were 2 hospitals within 6 miles of the hotel where the Carys were staying. Instead of simply bringing Roger to one of these hospitals, Simon drove 150 miles, presumably passing more hospitals along the way, to bring him to the hospital in Hereford. This decision does not make it appear as though his main motivation was Roger's health, nor does the fact that he made the frail older man, who could barely stand, try to walk to the hospital from the bus station. Simon was provided with a vehicle and did drive to the area, but for some reason would not drive all the way to the hospital to drop off Roger, instead trying to get him to attempt to make the last part of the unnecessarily long trip on foot. Simon also lied both about who he was and how he came to be with Roger and Hereford. While the fake persona of an American soldier and the made-up story about training at his dishonesty with the hospital staff, and later the police, kept them from identifying Roger for months, when he could have provided them with that information from the start. In a 2019 interview, Roger would explain his deception by essentially admitting that the plan was to abandon Roger, but just temporarily. He says that he did not want anyone to be able to identify Roger because he wanted the rest of the Curry family to have a break from caring for him for at least a week. If the hospital could not identify Roger, they could not locate his family, and they could enjoy their vacation while Roger was being cared for at the hospital. After leaving Roger and Hereford, Simon met back up with the rest of the Curry family and accompanied them on the next leg of their trip in Denmark. Kevin Curry has not spoken publicly very much about the case, but he has said that he did not abandon his father in a foreign country to place the burden and cost of his care on the British government as it appears. He claims that he did not abandon his father, he just asked a friend to take him to the hospital when he became ill after arriving in the UK. There are several glaring problems with this account, however. When Kevin purchased the airline tickets for the family trip, he bought round-trip tickets for everyone in the family except for Roger, indicating that he knew in advance that Roger would not be returning to the US with them. The most obvious reason Kevin looked suspicious is that he never returned to the UK to get his father out of the hospital before returning home, never reported him missing, and never showed any interest in finding him after he sent him off with Simon. Even if he did not plan to abandon his father, it could be argued that this lack of action amounts to abandonment. Kevin also lied to his extended family about where Roger was during the time he spent in the UK. Tim Otters, Kevin claimed that Roger was in a nursing home in Arizona and doing very well there. Police in England had researched people with the name of Roger Curry and families with that surname as a part of their investigation, and had been given Kevin Curry's contact information by authorities in the United States in March of 2016. When they called his phone number, the person who answered denied knowing a Roger Curry. There is, of course, the possibility that the police had the wrong number, or someone else answered Kevin's phone. However, shortly after police made this call, Kevin Curry made a call to Simon Hayes. Simon would later say that during this conversation, Kevin asked him not to come forward with his story about what had happened with his father because it would upset his mother. He also told him that Roger would become homeless if he was returned to the United States. There are, of course, enormous financial and emotional burdens placed on family members who are taking care of elderly dementia patients. However, thousands of families cope with these stresses without dumping their relative in a foreign country so that they can receive free care. Furthermore, all of the financial resources available to Roger do not appear to have been used for his benefit. Roger had Social Security benefits, a pension and veterans benefits that provided him with a modest monthly income of $1,500. It is unclear what happened to these payments during the 8 months Roger was in the UK. Since he was never reported missing, the issuing agencies would not have had a reason to stop making payments. While Roger and Mary Jo's house was essentially destroyed in the 2014 fire, they still owned the property in an upper-middle-class neighborhood, in a county famous for its expensive real estate. However, the property was not sold to help finance the care Roger and Mary Jo both needed. The Kays may have had limited resources, but they still had some that could have been utilized. In 2019, Simon Hayes was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison for his role in Roger's case. His lies, according to Simon Davis, the barrister who prosecuted him, resulted in an enormous waste of effort by the police and the fraudulent use of public funds. Roger's care during his time in the UK cost the National Health Service approximately £20,000. The defendant was part of a plan to bring Roger from the US and dump him in Hereford, abandoning him so that he could receive care from local healthcare providers. It was clearly planned, Davis told the court. Court documents in both California and the UK allege that Kevin Curry was under investigation for fraud and elder abuse, but neither the Los Angeles Police Department nor the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Office opened a formal investigation into the case, and no charges have ever been filed against Kevin Curry. While he had the most to gain from the alleged plot, only his accomplice is facing legal consequences from it. Following his identification, Roger Curry was repatriated to the United States in July of 2016. Upon his arrival, Los Angeles County officials filed an application to have a conservator appointed to handle Roger's care and affairs. No one in his family is prepared to accept responsibility for him, the application claimed. His own wife and son abused him when they took him overseas, only to abandon him there. Kevin and Mary Jo Curry did appear at some of the hearings relating to the conservatorship, but never formally contested it. Roger was ultimately placed under the care of a conservator, who arranged for his benefits to be used to get him treatment in a residential facility. Roger spent time in a few nursing homes before settling into one in Long Beach, California. Upon his arrival, he was still able to at least somewhat participate in activities like bingo and seemed happy. However, by 2019, his health had deteriorated to the point where he was almost completely bedridden, according to reports filed by his conservator. His caretaker said that he was still soft-spoken and respectful, even in his weakened state. Unfortunately, the solving of the Creedon Hill man case did not result in a happy ending. Roger Curry's identification did not result in a happy reunion with his family. Neither Kevin nor Mary Jo Curry has seen or visited Roger since his return to the United States. On September 12, 1988, Melissa Ann Tremblay, an 11-year-old girl, was found murdered at the Boston and Maine Railway Yard in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Our next case brings us to Salem, a historic city on the north shore of Greater Boston in Essex County, Massachusetts. Melissa Tremblay was born in 1977 in Salem, Massachusetts, to her mother Janet Tremblay. Janet raised Melissa as a single mother, as her father was absent and his identity remains unknown to this day. Everyone who knew Melissa as a child described her as a fun-loving, carefree, and caring little girl who had many friends in school and was always ready to play games and have a good time. However, sadly, it was this fun-loving nature that caused her to fall into the hands of her killer. On the 11th of September in 1988, Melissa accompanied her mother and her boyfriend to the LaSalle Social Club in Lawrence, not far from the rail yard where she was found, and went outside to play while the adults stayed inside. The last sightings of her alive were made by a railroad employee and a pizza delivery driver who were in the vicinity, both who saw her within the late afternoon hours of that day. When Janet realized her daughter was missing, she frantically searched the area before reporting her missing to the police at around 9 p.m. that night. She returned home in a state of panic, hoping and praying for news of her daughter's safety. Unfortunately, she would never receive this news. On the morning of September 12, 1988, Melissa was found dead in the Old Boston and Maine Railway Yard in Lawrence. She had been stabbed to death, and then her body had been left on the railway tracks and run over by a train. The detectives who arrived on the scene theorized that the killer had likely done this in the hopes of mingling the body and removing any possible physical evidence they had left behind. However, the forensic team that analyzed the body found that the nature of her stab wounds indicated that her killer was left-handed. The lead detective on the case was Lawrence Police Officer Detective Thomas Murphy. He was shocked at the brutality of the murder and decided to relentlessly pursue justice for Melissa. He and his team recovered physical evidence from the body and the crime scene, but the nature of this evidence was never revealed. However, it is assumed that since no arrests were made at the time, the evidence they gathered was not viable to be used in the investigation then, which is why it was shelved for later when forensic technology would develop enough for it to be used. Numerous witnesses, suspects, and persons of interest were interviewed by the police, and the only lead they found was that there was a suspicious-looking van in the area Melissa was in the day she was murdered. But when they inquired further, no one was able to help them identify the van or its owner, and as time went by, they found no new leads. The case remained unsolved, and eventually the trail went cold. Finally, in 2014, over 25 years later after the death of Melissa, the cold case was re-examined by authorities, and lead investigator, Lieutenant Peter Sherva, decided that the case should be reopened. A few years later, the evidence recovered from Melissa's body was submitted for testing. And in 2022, 33 years later, detectives finally had a suspect. On April 26, 2022, 74-year-old Marvin McClendon Jr., a former Massachusetts correction officer, was arrested in his home in Bremen, Alabama, for her murder by the Alabama State Police. While the nature of the evidence that was used to ascertain his guilt was never released to the public, the press release did state that evidence recovered from the body was crucial in identifying him as a suspect. And then when detectives probed deeper into his life, a whole set of incriminating details came to light. McClendon is a retired Massachusetts Department of Corrections employee, but he wasn't working for the state in 1988. He worked for the department on 3 separate occasions from 1970 to 2002, but at the time of the murder was involved in doing carpentry work in Chelmsford, a locality close to Lawrence. Detectives found that he also had multiple ties to Lawrence, which is close to Salem, where Melissa lived, as well as being the place her body was found. He worked in the city and frequented numerous establishments there, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Salem Street. He also had a van that looked like one that witnesses saw Melissa and near on the day she disappeared. This, along with the physical evidence tying him to the scene, was enough for the detectives to finally make an arrest in the case after a long wait of 33 years. The family released a statement in which they said, "We would like to thank the police who have worked so hard over the years to make sure justice was found. Since her murder in 1988, we have always prayed for justice. We have never stopped thinking of Missy." Some of Melissa's friends, who are now middle-aged adults, also provided statements. Andrea Gainley, who did not want her face shown, had a message for the defendant. "You took the life of an 11-year-old girl, and then you went on for another 33 years walking free. And where is she? In a grave." Both Melissa's family and friends are now awaiting the sentencing of Marvin McClendon. They are happy to have found the killer of their beloved Melissa after all these years and receive some form of closure. On April 26, 1993, in an act that stunned the community, immigrant shop owner Shu Ming Tang was shot and killed in the store he owned. Our first case today takes us to San Carlos, a city in San Mateo County, in the state of California in the United States of America. Shu Ming Tang was born and brought up in Taiwan. He was a family man and a beloved father and husband. He served as an officer in the Taiwanese Air Force and was highly decorated in terms of service before he retired and eventually shifted along with his family to the United States. He moved to the United States in the hopes of establishing a better life for his family. He was chasing the American dream. However, this dream would soon turn into a nightmare. Initially, everything was working out perfectly for Tang and his family. They moved to the city of San Carlos in California and began their new life together. Tang bought and began to run the Devonshire Little Store, a general store that made itself integral to the community in San Carlos. Tang and his family were beloved by all in the San Carlos community, who appreciated the integrity and love that the family ran their store with and made clear to all whom they interacted with. However, while it seemed apparent that everything was going well for Tang and his family, disaster was just around the corner. On the morning of April 26, 1993, Tang opened his store like he did every day. He did not know that this would be the last time he ever did so. That very day, Tang was shot in the chest by an unknown assailant in his store. He was rushed to the hospital, but died from his wounds soon after. The San Carlos community was shocked by the death of this beloved store owner. The initial investigation had very little to work with. The detective who originally worked the case was Sheriff Mark Robbins of the San Carlos Sheriff's Department. From interviews of eyewitnesses and those in the area, he learned that Tang was shot by an unknown woman who then fled the area soon after. No one knew the identity of the woman or her motive, but the motive of the crime was chalked down as a robbery that had gone wrong. There was very little evidence to work with, but through interviews with the eyewitnesses of the crime, the detectives were able to receive a composite sketch of what eyewitnesses believed the killer to look like. She was identified as a Caucasian woman in her late 20s or early 30s, with brown hair. However, witnesses were unable to provide the police with any more details about her. While there was some physical evidence found at the scene, DNA analysis at the time was not advanced enough to provide the investigators with any further leads. Still, this evidence was stored in case it would ever be useful in the future. But at the time, with no other solid leads to follow, investigators were unable to make any progress on the case, and eventually, the trail went cold. Days turned to months and months into years, and the case was shelved as an unsolvable cold case with little chance of being solved. Tang's family were left wondering who could have murdered their loved one for over 2 decades. The case, which made national headlines at the time and was even featured on the popular show America's Most Wanted, remained unsolved for almost 29 years. Time passed, and eventually, the San Mateo County absorbed the San Carlos Sheriff's Department into their larger operations. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation in 2010 after it started running police services for San Carlos. However, even for 8 years after this, there was no hope until the Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation in 2018, when they believed that it may be possible to find a suspect. Were the new leads on the case? During a recent investigation of this 29-year-old case in 2022, the detectives identified a person of interest which led investigators to Washington County, Oklahoma. On March 16th, San Mateo County Sheriff's detectives conducted simultaneous operations in Oklahoma as well as in Sacramento. During the operations, additional evidence was discovered, and as a result, sheriff's detectives arrested Rayana Hoffman Ramos, 63 years old, in Oklahoma. Until now, authorities still aren't saying how they linked Hoffman Ramos to Tang's death, or whether she gave specifics as to what happened in the store that tragic day in 1993. The detectives have only released that unspecified DNA evidence was found that linked her to the case as the guilty party. San Mateo County Sheriff Carlos Belanos thanked Tang's family for their support, adding that he hoped they will finally get the justice and closure that you deserve. The Devonshire Little Store is still in business nearly 29 years later. Though Shin Ming Tang's death happened decades ago, his legacy is still close to the current owner, Chung Sun, another immigrant owner who bought the store from Tang's widow shortly after his death. While he says he's relieved a suspect has been arrested, it doesn't change the tragedy that happened. This gentleman never did a bad thing to any other people, Sun said. While Tang's murder undoubtedly remains a tragedy, we hope that his family and loved ones have found some form of closure from the arrest of his killer after all these years. Justice for Tang's family is at hand, said San Mateo County Sheriff Carlos Bolanos at a press conference after the case was solved. Hoffman Ramos is currently being held without bail in Oklahoma, pending extradition to the Bay Area. On March 16, 1977, tragedy struck when Richard Backhell, Sr. was killed during an attempted burglary while at home with his children and wife. Our next case takes us to Alameda, a city in Alameda County, California, located in the East Bay region of the Bay Area. The city is primarily located on Alameda Island, but also spans Bay Farm Island and Coast Guard Island, as well as a few other smaller islands in San Francisco Bay. Richard Bichelle Sr. was born in 1934 in the United States of America. He was known as a kind man who would do whatever he could to help his friends and even strangers if it was possible. In his teens, he decided to join the military and became a U.S. Marine. He served in the Korean War in the 1950s and was respected as a great soldier and one of the finest of his generation. After his service, he retired from duty and worked as a mechanic and lived on the 2500 block of Lincoln Avenue in Alameda with his wife and 3 sons. He was beloved by his community and his family as a great husband and father, and a man who was kind and generous to all he met. However, while life seemed to be going well for the Bichelle family in 1977, disaster was just around the corner. In the early hours of the morning of March 16, 1977, there was a break-in and a tip to burglary at the Bichelle home. The thief was unable to escape unnoticed and was chased out of the house by a then 43-year-old Richard and his 17-year-old son. Richard Bichelle Jr., the father and son, chased the intruder onto the street, and as they pursued the thief, the younger Richard fell behind, unable to keep up with his father and the burglar. By the time he caught up with his father, he found him lying on the ground, and the burglar was nowhere to be seen. Richard Jr. found his father in a pool of blood with multiple stab wounds. In a haze, he ran back to the house and called the police and an ambulance. Richard Sr. was rushed to the hospital, but sadly it was too late, and he succumbed to his injuries a few hours later. His family was devastated by these events and were desperate for his killer to be brought to justice. At the time, investigators determined the victim, Richard Bichelle Sr., was stabbed a total of 10 times after confronting an individual who had attempted to burglarize his home, and the motive for the murder was chalked up to a burglary gone wrong. With this motive in mind, investigators looked at a number of possible suspects, including individuals with a past record of burglary, who had been convicted earlier. At the time, the investigation identified Richard Curly Bernard as a possible suspect and even searched his home, where they found a blood-stained jacket after the murder. However, due to limitations in DNA technology, charges could not be filed, and this piece of evidence was locked away in storage in the hopes that it could be used when technology advanced. With a lack of other leads, the investigators eventually hit a dead end, and the case turned cold. Over 4 decades went by, and in 2021, the Alameda Police Department quietly established a cold case unit. It was composed of a small team of retired Alameda police officers and 2 sergeants who were still active on the force. The unit is led by retired Detective Lorenzo Graham. Bichelle Jr. had asked that his father's case be reopened 23 years prior to this in the late 1990s. But at the time, the police force was reluctant to do so, as they were unsure whether the technological resources required to solve this case were available. However, once the cold case unit was started in 2021, the Richard Bichelle murder was one of the first cases they chose to reopen, due to the fact that they had a great deal of evidence from the case stored away. They began by submitting the bloody jacket confiscated from the suspect Bernard's home, as well as other pieces of evidence, to the Serological Research Institute, a non-profit California corporation that provides a broad spectrum of biological testing services. When the blood on the jacket was tested, it came back as a positive match to Richard Bichelle. Senior APD had questioned Bernard shortly after the murder, but the technology at the time did not give them the ability to determine whose blood it was. But that had now changed with the advancement in technology, said the lead detective Lorenzo Graham. With this positive match, along with circumstantial evidence, the detectives had found it was finally proved that Richard Curly Bernard was the killer of Richard Bichelle Sr. all those years ago. The detectives immediately began to look for Bernard, hoping to charge and arrest him for the murder. But they were left disappointed. They found out that Bernard was a career criminal who was arrested and convicted for a series of Alameda burglaries and 2 non-sexual assaults in the 1970s. Bernard was also alleged to have committed more than 100 burglaries. He was imprisoned in 1977 after being convicted for a number of burglaries and the 2 counts of sexual assaults, but was released from jail in 1983. Upon his release, Bernard was paroled to the state of Texas. They found that in 1989, Bernard was killed in an act of carrying out another crime. Though justice could not be served to the criminal, the Alameda Police Department announced at a press conference on March 22, 2022, that the department had finally solved the 45-year murder investigation. While Bernard is deceased and therefore cannot face his day in court, we have given the opportunity to provide answers to the Bichelle family, said Lorenzo Graham. At the press conference at the Alameda Free Library, Richard Bichelle Jr., who was with his father all those years ago on the fateful night of the robbery, was also present at the press conference. It's been a long, hard road, but I'm glad we have a final resolution to this. On behalf of my family, my late mother, my 2 younger brothers, I'd like to just say thank you to everyone, Bichelle Jr. said. I don't know if there's any real closure, you know? It doesn't change a whole lot, but we are glad we do have a final positive ID, and we can go from there. Though it is truly sad that justice could not be served to Bichelle Sr.'s murderer, we hope that his family and friends can find solace and some form of closure in knowing who was responsible for his untimely and tragic death. Carolyn Smith, originally named Opal Mary Carey, was born in Indianapolis, Indiana. By 1944, at the age of 51 and widowed, she resided at 10 East 21st Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, living in a duplex. She had moved there shortly after her husband passed away in early 1935. Carol and shared her half of the duplex with two younger women who she referred to as her roommates to the neighbors. These women were Virginia Evans, age 31, and Willetta Horner, aged 30. Carol and Virginia had met in 1937 at a Christian Science bookstore. They struck up a friendship and Virginia moved in with Carol and a short time later. Carol Ann and Willetta met a year later at a grocery store. At first, they were mere acquaintances, but Willetta eventually confided in Carol and the details of her troubled childhood. Carol Ann then asked Willetta to move into the duplex with her. In 1944, many everyday items, from sugar to gasoline, were rationed by the U.S. government because of shortages caused by World War II. Items that were in short supply for civilian consumers, either because of disrupted trade routes or because the armed forces required large quantities of them, required a government-issued stamp in order to be purchased. Individuals were issued ration books containing these stamps and could only purchase the amount of rationed items they had stamps for. Carol and Smith applied for 7 ration books, telling the ration board that the books were for her children and dependents. Carol and had no children who had lived more than a few days after their birth. 2 of the ration books were in the names of her 2 roommates. However, 3 of the books were issued to individuals who were deceased: Carol Ann's late husband, father, and maid. Another one of the books was issued to Carol Ann's 11-year-old nephew, Bobby, who Carol Ann claimed was living with her. The final ration book was issued in the name of Carol Ann's bulldog, Bon Bon. The numerous ration books Carol Ann acquired raised suspicion with the ration board, who asked the Tulsa Police Department to investigate her for fraud. As a part of their investigation, police began interviewing Carol Ann's neighbors, almost all of whom had bizarre tales to tell about 10 East 21st Street and its inhabitants. The neighbors reported hearing bizarre growls and screams coming from the home, and a witness saw the 3 women who lived there burying something behind the house at midnight one night. Based on these statements, the police were able to obtain a warrant to search the home. As a part of their search, police excavated the backyard of the property. The objects that witnesses had seen being buried turned out to be coffins. Inside were the remains of 2 dogs, one of which was Bon the bulldog. Inside the house, police discovered a scene that would inspire a local media frenzy. They found Carol and Smith's 2 roommates, barefoot, cold, dirty, and hungry. Their clothes were dirty because they were given barely enough water to drink and had none left over for laundry. Police found their sleeping quarters in the unheated basement. Their beds were made out of crates, and they had only threadbare clothing. A repairman eventually came forward to confirm that at least one of the women had lived like this for some time. When he had come to work on the furnace in the middle of the winter, one of the 2 women, not specified in any of the accounts, was wandering around the basement with no shoes and inadequate clothing for the weather. When he told her he needed to extinguish the pilot light to work on the furnace, she informed him that the small flame was the only source of heat she had. Virginia and Willetta's living conditions were in stark contrast to Carol Ann's. While they lived in cold and filth in the basement without even bare necessities, she lived a luxurious life in the rest of the house. Willetta and Virginia cooked Carol Ann's meals and cleaned the home for her. She had enough makeup and perfume to stock a drugstore, according to newspaper reports at the time. She owned a $250 silver set and drove a Packard. When police searched the home, she had 18 pairs of gloves, 26 hats, and over 200 pairs of shoes. Many of the items Carol Ann had in excess in her home were rationed at the time, and it is unclear how she amassed such a large number of them, even with her extra ration books. Both Virginia and Willetta had jobs outside of the home, but they always returned to the home and the deplorable living conditions they were provided with there after work. They also turned over every cent of the money they made to Carol Ann. According to both of the young women, they never tried to escape because of a hex Carol Ann had placed on them. The women claimed that they had been hypnotized by Carol Ann and gave accounts of being verbally abused and manipulated by occult means. They were alienated from their own families and pitted against one another. Carol Ann concocted false stories about each of the girls and was able to convince them that they were true and that she could expose their depravity. Carol Ann pieced together her own religion from occult practices and Christian beliefs, convinced that they would burn in hell if they did not do everything she, the one person who could save them from damnation, told them to do. Having been convinced that they would be rewarded in heaven for obeying Carol and Smith, Virginia and Willetta lived in the basement and worked as virtual slaves in the house for years. They both also behaved aggressively against their neighbors at Carol Ann's behest. A previous resident of the other half of the duplex reported that Virginia had once lured him to a window on Carol Ann's side of the duplex and thrown boiling water on him. Other prior tenants of the duplex claimed that Willetta would regularly instigate fights with them. Willetta and Virginia confirmed these accounts after being found by police, but insisted that they only behaved this way because Carolyn had ordered them to. The reports of hexes, abuse, blackmail, and the occult coming out of 10 East 21st Street quickly put it at the center of a media circus. The Tulsa Tribune dubbed Carol an Ashish Bengali. The house became known as the Hex House, and Carol Ann was often referred to as the Hex Mistress. While the witchcraft and the brainwashed women kept in the basement were the most sensational part of the story in the eyes of the media, there was plenty more to the concerning case of Carol and Smith. In addition to Virginia and Willetta's salaries, Carol Ann supported her lifestyle largely through fraud. She convinced Virginia's father, a wealthy businessman in Stroud, Oklahoma, that his daughter was seriously ill and required private nursing services to save her life. He sent her more than $17,000 for his daughter's care that went instead to Carol Ann's extravagant spending. Carol Ann's other attempts to defraud appear to be mainly centered around insurance fraud. Virginia and Willetta may not have been the first victims of what would become known as the Hex House. A woman ran out of Carol Ann's side of 10 East 21st Street screaming. She ran out into the street and was hit by a car. She was taken to a hospital but passed away due to her injuries a week later. Carol Ann Smith told authorities that the woman was Beulah Walker, a 45-year-old widow who worked as a nurse in Carol Ann's home. Police were never able to get in contact with anyone from Beulah's family, and Carol Ann insisted on handling her funeral arrangements. Carol Ann had a large insurance policy on Beulah's life. She also later told the insurance company that Beulah had been a wealthy aunt of hers, which earned her an additional payout. The insurance company was suspicious, however, and began investigating Carol Ann's policy. They discovered that Beulah Walker had in fact been a poorly paid servant in the house and canceled the policy. Just 1 month before police found Virginia and Willetta in the basement of the Hex House, Carol Ann had taken at-large life insurance policies on both of the young women. There were a number of other suspicious deaths that came to people close to Carol, and, although not all of them resulted in a financial gain for her, Carol Ann had first moved into 10 East 21st Street at the beginning of 1935, not long before the death of Beulah Smith and not long after the death of Carol Ann's husband, Fay H. Smith, using a shotgun triggered with a twig in 1934. While Fay had recently lost his job, like many others during the Great Depression, none of his friends or previous co-workers believed he would have taken this course of action, even though Carol Ann had apparently extensively discussed it as an option with him shortly before his death. Carol Ann received a $31,000 payout from the insurance policy on her husband's life. That amount is equivalent to more than $450,000 today. In January of 1935, the managers of the apartment building where Carol Ann had lived with her husband raised her rent to force her out because they did not care for her. The rent hike worked, and she moved into 10 East 21st Street. The criminal investigator assigned to investigate Foy Smith's death died shortly after taking on the case. Carol Ann's sister had also recently passed away. The driver who had struck and killed Beulah Walker, Captain Rains, died suddenly just a short time after the accident. He had refused to ever say a word about the accident to anyone, including his family. When Carol Ann moved into the duplex in January of 1935, she wanted her father to move in with her from his home in St. Louis because, she said, it was too large for her to live alone in. She went to St. Louis several times to help him prepare to relocate. However, her father died before his move to Tulsa, providing Carol Ann with another massive insurance payout. The officiant, who had presided over all of the funerals Carol Ann had to organize, also passed away around this time. The next suspicious death would not take place for several years. Mary Horner, Willetta's mother, suddenly passed away shortly after arriving in Tulsa to look for her daughter. She was only ever tried for relatively minor ones. In October of 1944, She was tried for inducing Virginia and Willetta to testify falsely against a neighbor. After a 3-day trial, she was found guilty and sentenced to a year in prison. A month later, she pled guilty to federal charges of perjury, mail fraud, obtaining money under false pretenses, and using false statements to obtain a ration book for her bulldog, Bon Bon. After serving her sentence, Carol left Oklahoma. Nothing is known about what became of her, and it has been speculated that she may have changed her identity. The duplex that contained the Hex house was torn down in 1975, and the basement where Virginia and Willetta were held was filled in with dirt. Eventually, a parking lot was built on the site where the home once stood. The parking lot has since been abandoned. The set of stairs that Beulah Walker ran down just before being hit by a car are still on 21st Street. Reported incidents of cars starting up on their own, even without keys in the ignition, while parked in the lot where the Hex house once stood, kept alive the story of the 2 bewitched women held as slaves in the home and the mystique around it for many years. Today, Tulsans are reminded of the sensational tale that once gripped their city by an area haunted house that hosts an attraction inspired by the story of Carol and Smith and the events that transpired at 10 East 21st Street. Wilford Johnson, who went by his middle name, Ray, was a veteran of the United States Navy. In 2017, the 90-year-old was a widower, having lost his wife Ola and lived on his own in Longview, Washington. He was considered a fixture in his community, active in his church, and always willing to help his neighbors. He had 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and 15 great-grandchildren, all of whom he enjoyed spending time with. Even at his advanced age, Ray's mind was sharp, and he made sure to keep physically active. On June 29, 2017, sometime between 9 and 10 a.m., Ray's neighbors saw him out for his daily walk. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Ray. Ray's family reported him missing the following morning. His silver 2001 Honda Accord was also missing from the home, but was located later that night. However, its discovery only added to the mystery of Ray's disappearance. The car was found in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Skamania County on National Forest Road 93. This location was more than 130 miles away from Ray's home. According to Ray's family, he had no reason for being in that area. He also had not driven on the freeway in more than 7 years. One of the car's windows was broken when it was found, but police were quickly able to discover why. Pictures of the car were posted on Facebook, and police interviewed the 3 young men who uploaded the images. The young men, unaware that the car belonged to a missing person, found it abandoned and decided to break the window so that they could steal some small items inside of it. Authorities do not believe the young men were involved in Ray's disappearance. The area where the car was found was searched multiple times by multiple agencies, but nothing related to the case was found. Ray's family believes that he was most likely attacked in Longview, and that his assailant then drove his car out of town. Ray carried a large amount of cash with him, making robbery a potential motive. A clerk from a dollar store in Longview did come forward after Ray went missing, saying that a man matching Ray's description had been in his store around noon, the day Ray went missing. However, the store's security footage was not of a good enough quality for Ray's family to tell if it had in fact been Ray in the store that day. Ray did shop at that store, but authorities consider this sighting to be unconfirmed. Ray's disappearance remains unsolved. Hattie Brown was an accomplished member of the United States Army, which she entered in 1980. She became the first woman in her unit to attend airborne school and to earn her aerosol badge. She achieved the rank of Sergeant First Class and served in Operation Desert Storm in 1991. In 1998, Hattie left the Army so that she could help take care of her aging mother. Hattie was one of 11 siblings and would do anything to help her family. It appears as though Hattie was helping a family member the last time she was seen. Surveillance cameras at a Sheetz gas station at the intersection of highways 501 and 58 in Riverdale, Virginia, captured the last known images of 48-year-old Hattie on May 16, 2009 at 2:30 a.m. Hattie was with her nephew, Derek Brown. Their family believes that Hattie must have been helping Derek because she would not normally be out at that hour. There have been no sightings of her since she left the gas station in her car with Derek. Hattie had organized a bridal shower for her soon-to-be sister-in-law, but failed to show up for the event, which alerted her family that something was wrong. Several other details led them to fear that something terrible had happened to Hattie. While Hattie's car, a 2003 Volkswagen Jetta, went missing with her wallet, credit cards, medication, and driver's license were all left at her home. Her family says that she never left home without them. She also left behind her beloved Chihuahua Grasshopper, which her family says she would not have done willingly. Virginia State Police monitored Hattie's bank records, but had few other avenues of investigation to follow during the first few weeks after Hattie went missing. That changed on July 7, 2009. That day, a farmer was cutting hay on his property in southeastern Halifax County, Virginia, approximately 15 miles from the gas station where Hattie had last been seen. Behind an old barn, he discovered a badly burned Volkswagen Jetta that appeared to have been behind the barn for some time. When authorities examined the vehicle, they discovered that it belonged to Hattie Brown. The discovery of the vehicle led to speculation that someone local was involved in Hattie's disappearance, because only someone who lived in the area would know that farmer very rarely visited that section of his property. Following the discovery of the car, Derek Brown was named a person of interest in the case. He and several other people authorities believe may have information about what happened to Hattie have not cooperated with the investigation. Derek has never been charged in relation to his aunt's disappearance, but is currently in prison for burglary and will be released in 2022. 7 years after Hattie went missing, her family made the difficult decision to have her declared legally dead. 3 of Hattie's brothers have passed away in the 10 years since she went missing, never knowing